I recently went to the Goodwill bins for the first time and bought a pile of clothes which needed work. So in this video, I'm going to show you 5 quick and easy upcycles you can try yourself. These Levi's were perfect except for the tear in the knee, which I stuck my foot through every time I tried to put them on. To fix it, I decided to patch them using sashiko, the Japanese practice of visible mending. For the patch, I used a fabric which had a similar weight to the torn pants. First, I marked the patch, then I cut it to size, then used a blanket stitch to prevent the edges from fraying. I used a thread in a similar color, doubled and knotted at the end. You could use a simple whip stitch instead, or you could finish the edges on a machine, but I wanted to do this project by hand, so I used a blanket stitch. Then I trimmed and blanket stitched around the tear as well. After securely pinning the patch in place, I attached the patch to the pant using a running stitch and heavy-duty top stitch thread with a fairly long needle. Since I started my patch on the side seam to cover the rip, my stitches were fairly big because of the bulk, but they got smaller once I got past the seams. Here's the completed patch from the inside. You can see how the ripped area is nice and secure. And another thing I like about this method is that the fabric is soft and flexible, but also strong because of the stitching. And it didn't take very long either. I was originally looking for a cozy textured sweater, but this was the closest thing I could find at the bins. The sleeves were a little too long, and because the seams were so bulky, it's a bit lumpy, so I thought if I removed the cuffs and the waistband, it might be a little more like a sweater. I wanted to keep as much of the original fabric as possible, but this was a difficult fabric to seam rip because the texture hid the stitches. So I had to cut off the cuffs and the waistband in order to expose the seams so I could unpick them. After I'd removed the waistband, I found out the lining was smaller than the outer shell, so I had to reduce the width of the shell by 2 inches. To take in each side seam an inch, I drew a line at an angle, starting from the original seam near the armpit down to 1/2 inch from the original seam at the hem. Then I sewed along the line. This was my first time sewing a boucle knit, and my machine, which is a basic vintage Singer, had no problems with it. I just used a regular straight stitch. Afterwards, I trimmed the side seams and seam ripped the old seams so that the seam allowances would lay flat in order to reduce bulk. I carefully pinned the lining in place all the way around the hem, then sewed it in place close to the fold, making sure to catch both the lining and the shell. The sleeves were pretty simple. I just folded the hem up twice, pinned it in place, then sewed from one placket to the other. Finally, I hand sewed the 2 sleeve plackets together with a whip stitch. When I came across this pant at the bins, I remembered seeing these trousers online, which I thought would make a great refashioning project. So with this refashion, I wanted to see if I could take in the waist of a pair of oversized pants by sewing some pleats in the front. Using a seam ripper, I removed the belt loops from the front of the pants. Then I tried the pants on, pinched out the excess, and pinned the pleats into place. Once I knew how much to take in, I measured and adjusted the pleats to make them even. Since the machine would have to sew through so many layers of fabric, I gave the seams a few whacks with the mallet to help flatten them. But first I put a yoga mat on the floor to help absorb the sound and avoid irritating my neighbors. To hold the pleat in place, I sewed a rectangle around it. I stitched just inside the waistband and along the folds of the pleat with a matching thread color because I didn't want the stitching to be visible. I also used a heavy-duty jeans needle, which is less likely to break when going through so many layers of fabric. My machine really struggled with the thickness of the fabric, so I went very slowly and turned the wheel by hand when the machine got stuck. The original belt loops were about a half an inch from the top of the waistband, which was fortunate because that's just below the thickest section of the pleat. To reattach the belt loops, I used a straight stitch and back-tacked a few times. Then I sewed on the bottom of the loop and repeated everything on the other side. This dress was made of a neoprene-like fabric, which I liked the feel of, and I loved the print, but the dress itself wasn't really my style. However, I could see myself wearing it as a skirt, so I did some surgery. First, I cut the top from the bottom, approximately a half inch above the zipper, by measuring down 2.5 inches from the waistband to keep the distance consistent. Then I pinned the lining to the skirt fabric all the way around the waistband. My plan was to zigzag along the waist to hold the lining and the skirt together, but that turned out to be more challenging than I expected because my sewing machine kept dropping stitches and fraying the thread. After much experimentation and testing, I was able to finish the edges with a zigzag stitch on a wide width and a 2mm length. It still skipped stitches on the seams where the fabric was thicker, so I went back and added more zigzags in those areas. It wasn't pretty, but it should prevent the edges from fraying. Next, I folded the waistband over about half an inch and pinned it into place. Then I attempted to sew it down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'd watched other YouTubers sew stretch fabrics with a regular straight stitch, but my machine simply refused. It dropped more stitches than it sewed, so I tried every combination of variables on my machine and eventually got it to work with a setting called straight stretch stitch. The stretch stitch dropped stitches as well, but only in a few places, so I just went back over the seam to fill in the gaps. It doesn't look that great, but it should hold. Refashioning is full of surprises, and this was one of the most tricky fabrics I've come across. Originally, I was planning to shorten the skirt, but since this fabric is so difficult to work with, I'm going to leave it as is. This was a very pretty dress, actually, but I knew I wouldn't wear it very often. However, I did need a pair of pajama pants, so I decided to turn the skirt portion into a pair of flowy pants. First, I cut the skirt from the top as close to the waistband as possible. Then I removed the side seams, keeping as close to the seams as possible to preserve the fabric. And then I did the same thing with the hem. This dress was made from viscose, which was a tricky fabric to work with, so I pinned the fabric together with the right sides facing to stabilize it a little before cutting. The easiest way to make pants is simply to cut a U shape near the top, but I wanted these pants to fit my body a little better, so I used a pair of pajama pants as a pattern. First, I placed one leg inside the other to expose the crotch seams. After finding the midpoint of my fabric, I placed the back, which is the longer half of the crotch seam, slightly to the side of the center, leaving more fabric on the back side of the pant to allow for the butt. You can adjust the position depending on your shape. I have some extra padding back there, so I gave it about 2 inches. Also, I left about 1.5 inches at the top to allow for the elastic casing. After refolding the pajama pants so that the front seam was exposed, I traced it from the crotch seam to the waistband. So now I had a U shape with the back slightly higher than the front to allow for the butt. After adding 1.5 inches for the casing, I drew a horizontal line from the front seam to the vertical edge of the fabric. I measured the distance from the waistband to the hem on the front side and transferred that measurement to the back side so that the two sides would be the same length. Finally, I drew a line from the side measurement to the back seam to complete the pattern. Then I simply cut along the top of the waistband and the U-shaped crotch seam. To sew the pants, I sewed along the U-shaped crotch with the right sides of the fabric facing each other, using a straight stitch very close to the edge because I want to preserve as much fabric as possible. When I got to the front of the waistband, I left a gap for the elastic. Then I finished the raw edges with a medium zigzag stitch with this overcast foot. I usually use the standard foot for zigzags, but this foot does help keep the fabric flat when using a zigzag to finish the raw edges on a lightweight fabric like this one. After the crotch seam was completed, I refolded the pant so that the two front sides lined up with the two back sides. If you want to try on the pant at this point, you can pin the sides together with a safety pin and slip them on to see if they fit. To sew up the side seams, I made sure the right sides of the fabric faced each other and sewed them with a very small seam allowance because I wanted to keep as much of the flowers as possible. To finish the raw edges, I used the zigzag stitch with the overcast foot again. To create the casing for the elastic, I folded up the edge of the gap in the front seam and ironed it into place. Then I turned up and ironed a fold 1/4 inch from the edge all around the waist. Then I folded the edge over again, making sure it was wide enough to accommodate the elastic and the seam. So for me, that came to about 1/2 inch. Then I sewed around the casing as close to the folded edge as possible. After attaching a safety pin to a section of 1/4 inch elastic, I threaded the elastic through the casing, tried on the pant to determine the correct length for the elastic, then sewed the two ends in place by overlapping them and sewing with a zigzag stitch. My elastic wasn't quite long enough to go around my waist, so I sewed 2 sections together, and that's why the ends are different colors. The final step was to hem the pant, which I ironed first because the fabric is so slippery. So I simply folded the hem over 1/4 inch 2 times and ironed it in place. Then I sewed the hem as close to the fold as possible on both legs. Finally, I closed the gap in the front with a few hand stitches because the edges were starting to fray. I also added a button because it's hard to tell the front from the back when you're pulling on the pajama pants. And that's it. The skirt is now a pair of pants. So here's what the jeans looked like before and after. I think this sashiko technique is a great way of patching jeans because it doesn't require a sewing machine and very little sewing skill. Anyone can do a running stitch, and even if your stitches are uneven like mine, it still looks good and will prevent your jeans from accidentally turning into shorts. Originally, this jacket was more of an outer layer, and I was looking for something warm to wear around the house, especially when I'm working on the computer. So I think the refashion version will work better for my needs. It's also a little more flattering, in my opinion. These pants were so big they kept slipping off before I altered them. So just by adding a few pleats, it changed these pants from unwearable to wearable. And I'm also really happy with the way they look. They're a change from jeans, but just as comfortable and low maintenance. The fluorescent colors of this print are like the colors on a coral reef, and the fabric feels like a wetsuit, so it reminds me of the ocean. It also has a great soft, stretchy feel to it, so it's very comfortable, and I'm much more likely to wear it as a skirt than as a dress. The original dress was very pretty, but these are more my style, and I know I'll wear the pants a lot more. Actually, they're more like something between a skirt and pants. A scant, or maybe a pert. Either way, I'm sure I'll wear them, and I still have fabric left over from the top, which I can use for something else. So it's a win-win. Every upcycle is unique. That's kind of the fun of it, and I hope this video gave you some ideas and techniques and inspiration to help you refashion your own clothes. Personally, I learned a lot from these upcycles because I'd never worked with boucle, viscose, or neoprene before. Upcycling is a great, inexpensive way to develop your sewing skills, and even if you don't like the finished project, at least you learned something. And you can always alter your creations or use the fabric for other projects. So I hope this inspires you to try your own refashioning project. Thanks for watching, and happy upcycling!